so that we can get to everyone. And I do ask one question per person, unless the trickle of questions really dries up, and then I'll allow more questions to people. But for now, let's keep it to... Yeah, so like I said, one question per person, try and keep them short. Leave a line out here, and leave a line right here. All right, so I see you're first. All right, so I'll
So I'm just curious how the demonstration at Charlottesville did not represent like the fear and the present threat of violence, given the fact that people gathered to express hatred towards people of color, and then that day a man was assaulted by a gang of white supremacists. A man of color was assaulted by a gang of white supremacists in a parking lot. So I'm confused how there's not a correlation. How did their gathering not represent a direct present threat of violence that should be censored?
Yeah, no, I understand that question. Did everybody hear that question? I hope so. Yeah, that's the standard is it has to be a direct call to violence right here and right now. Certainly the person who committed the crime, and that's not protected speech. I don't know if you're talking about the person who drove the car into somebody, or you're talking about a different situation. I think the person who drove the car, I think that was the next day, if I remember correctly. So they had this hideous tiki torch march. I could be wrong on this. My memory is that the violence took place the following day. And certainly, if somebody is there urging people to attack others, that's not protected speech. And there are many cases about it. There was just an activist, Black Lives Matter activist, oh God, I'm forgetting him, DeRay McKesson, who got charges thrown out against him. He was charged in Louisiana for inciting violence. And the court ruled that it was whatever calls he was making were not so direct and so specific to a specific incident that he could be charged for it. So I think that's the answer. Certainly, the person who drove the car is arrested, will be charged. The evidence will be what it will be. And the person is, unless there's something we're not knowing, likely spend the rest of his life in prison or executed. But you have to distinguish between disruptive speech. You know, I'm sure there are people here who march, you know, calling for revolution. I mean, that can't be prosecuted for that. It's too vague. That's like sometime down the future. On the other hand, if you say, go hit that person, that's not protected. So I think it's a time and circumstance.
Alrighty, and if anyone wants to come down in the meantime, grab a pocket constitution or a placard.
You're taking home those pocket constitutions whether you want to or not.
Oh man. Alright, we have a question about community certificate about wire. There we go.
Yeah. Good evening, Professor. So you were saying that unlawfulness is not protected by freedom of speech.
I'm sorry, what?
You're saying that unlawfulness is not protected by the freedom of speech, but don't you think that discrimination, which could be represented in hate speech, is an intrusion of law and therefore should be prohibited?
Well, that's a very good question and a very interesting area of law. There are statutes and laws that prohibit discrimination in employment, discrimination in many different fields. But they're not really punishing the words, they're punishing the conduct. And that's something maybe I should have made clear when I was speaking. The conduct is discriminating against someone in employment. The word said may be evidence of that discrimination, but they're actually not punishing the words, they're punishing the discrimination itself. So that's a distinction. And conduct, in most circumstances, there is some conduct that's considered speech, but conduct is generally not protected in the criminal sense and the discrimination sense. So that was a really good question. It's a nuance, but understand what they're doing. They're prohibiting the discrimination, and the speech is just evidence of the discrimination.
All right, next one in here. Oh, hold on.
We don't have to recover the microphone.
You said something about so speech that either incites violence or poses like an immediate threat, like that is not considered protected under the freedom of speech, right?
if it's a direct incitement, it can't be a generalized, let's have a revolution sort of thing.
So my thing that I was thinking about is how what is considered a direct is also like dependent on where we are culturally. So something that could say what is a direct threat and what we consider a direct threat could depend on where we are like within the cultural context. So something can be considered a threat if it is to incite violence in one point of time, can be considered not to incite violence in another point of time. For instance, like if you think about prior to kind of the rise of the Nazis, you can think about swastika as not something that could incite violence, but in kind of the context of Nazi Germany, it could be simply to incite violence.
Well, I mean, that's, on a First Amendment basis, a swastika, as horrendous as it is protected speech. Okay, it's the First Amendment applies. And that's why neo-Nazis get to march on public campuses and in public streets. The issue of evaluating the directness of the threat and whether it constitutes a threat, I'm not aware if the cases have addressed the cultural aspect. They always focus on the temporal aspect and the physical aspect. Are you in time threatening somebody right now? But they make very clear that that person's subjective feelings about it are not part of the equation. So the fact that culturally you might find, or some person might find words particularly offensive, does not deprive the speaker of the ability to say them, and it doesn't make them rise to the level of an unprotected threat. And I think the cases are pretty clear on that. Whether that's good or bad, you know, when we talk about the law, it is what it is. I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm just saying that that's how courts look at it, in that time and place, not the subjective feelings of the person on the receiving end.
Is it quick? Because I really would like to do one question per person.
Even if there's a direct correlation, so for instance, let's say in a world where every time some symbol was drawn, somebody was hurt, you know, like an immediate temporal, if there was that kind of direct correlation, that still wouldn't apply, because hate speech can say immediate violence.
Well, I'm not aware of a case that has ruled on it. I haven't looked for that specific thing. I would be very surprised if that sort of correlation were deemed sufficient, because how would the speaker know that? How do you protect? How do you decide what is protected or what's not? So I don't think that correlation. I don't think the court would find that a sufficient connection.
Hi, Professor Jacobson. I'm just coming from outside, couldn't hear anything I just said, but I'm trying my best. Thank you for coming.
It was brilliant.
Yeah, I would like to ask you a philosophical question. What is the philosophical root cause of this idea of violence against speech is okay coming from, whether it's left and right, or college campuses, or rhetoric coming from Washington, D.C., in your opinion?
What is the root cause of it?
Yes.
Well, the problem of campus shutdowns and shutdowns and things long predates Donald Trump. I've been covering this for almost the full 9 years of my website. It's trite, and I hate the phrase political correctness. There is a view that only certain ideas should be accepted, and that those get enforced, and that people take great offense when those norms are breached, and feel that it's violence against them. I mean, I have seen some of the emails circulated about me, and they, for some reason, felt that I was putting people in danger by coming here, which shocked me. I think people have become so sensitive to things, and it's not for me to judge whether they deserve to be or shouldn't be, but people have, in fact, become so sensitive to various things that I think they take greater offense to things than used to be taken offense to. A lot of jokes that now are deemed demeaning, maybe 10 years ago weren't, and things just seem to have become a lot more sensitive to things. And I think the reaction when you're sensitive to something is essentially to react to it. And I think that's what's happening on campuses. People feel a speaker comes and is going to express ideas they don't agree with, and that's a threat to them somehow. Even though I look at it and I say, no, it's not. But I think that's the cause.
Next.
Alright, so here's my question. I heard you making a good few comparisons between the rights enjoyed by Americans in the U.S., or people in the U.S., as opposed to the rights enjoyed by students on a college campus. You were comparing and saying how we might like to have those same rights on campus. But in my opinion, that college campus has a very different mandate from a country. Well, part of the mandate is opening up intellectual inquiry, not only in the sense of allowing for all things to be said, but in the sense of investigating knowledge, and in particular, of allowing certain historically marginalized voices to be heard more clearly. I can see how, in the context of a full country and constitutions might be different. But wouldn't you say that because of this, speech on campus, on private campus at least, should be regarded somewhat differently because of the different mandate?
And I think I have said that. I think you have to decide how far you want to go with that. An analogy I frequently use, I don't know if it's a perfect analogy or not, is that you may have a right on the street in front of my house to shout whatever you want to shout. You may even have the right, there are a lot of court cases on this, whether you can put a pamphlet at my door and come and knock and proselytize me. You don't have the right to come into my living room and sit on my couch and shout stuff at me. And the question is, do you want the college campus to be such a private space that it's the equivalent of your living room, where others can't intrude? But if you can't do that, how are you going to interact with people? How are you going to have that intellectual stimulation? How are you going to have the kind of campus, at least Vassar says it wants to have, if that's what you're going to do? And what if somebody else on this campus feels this campus is their living room too? And they don't want you saying stuff in their living room. So that's why I say, try not to live in the moment. Try to think of the bigger picture and try to err when you can on the side of more speech, not less speech. But clearly I've acknowledged a private campus has competing interests that don't exist beyond the gates.
Someone else around here? Who's next? Someone? Going once? Going twice? All right. So there's no one in line on this side, so another one from up here.
Hello, Professor. So the question I have is regarding the specific nature of incitement, and I just want to know because the example I want to give, I guess, because I'm not 100% trying to phrase it, is let's say in this theoretical scenario, someone goes to a neo-Nazi rally, and that inspires them to go immediately commit an act of violence. Even if that act isn't criminally liable, even if the person who gave that speech couldn't be put in jail, is there some other kind of way to hold them accountable for that action, or the civil means, and would that be constitutional to have a statute such as that?
Well, when you enforce something civilly, it's still the government enforcing it, because you go to the court system, the court system enforces it. I think you would again have to have a close proximate causation. The mere fact that somebody went to a rally where they were saying nasty things and decided to then commit a crime. Now, if the speaker at the rally says, at the count of 3, we're all going to run to that store and smash the windows, that's a different story. That person could be both criminally liable and also civilly liable. But I don't see civil liability merely because someone attended your speech and got the dumb idea to go out and commit an act of violence, unless you somehow directly caused them to do that. And that's what the case was with the Black Lives Matter person in Louisiana. While he was saying things which arguably could have incited people to get agitated, he didn't say, go punch that person.
Okay. Anyone online who wants to ask a question? Okay.
All right, Professor, foremost, I want to thank you for coming and speaking to us today. So my question is, do you feel as though free speech has been limited by certain college and university faculty through the assignment of poor grades and student work that is right-wing and conservative? And if so, do you think that students are forced to write and espouse one set of ideals to receive the grades that they want?
It's very hard to prove that. evidentiary. I hear that complaint from a lot of students because I'm the advisor to the College of Republicans, to the Cornell Review, which is a conservative newspaper, to the Young Americans for Freedom, to one or two other groups. Basically, if you're a conservative group on campus and you need a faculty advisor, I'm the one you go to. So I hear these things a lot, but I don't know how you prove it, you know? And I'd like to think that faculty don't do that, but I think there's a perception that they do. And that perception is something that I don't think gets addressed. And when you have such a domination of the faculty by one political ideology, and it's so clearly flaunted, and I'm not talking about Vassar, I'm talking about in general, and it might be true of Vassar, it might not, but where everybody is left on the faculty, and only a handful are not on the left, I think students get the message. And that's what I hear. They get the message. They know exactly what to write. They don't want to risk a bad grade. So there's definitely a perception. But whether that perception is reality, I have no way of judging. Any stories I've heard are anecdotal, you know.
Hi, Professor. I just have a quick question. I received Pell Grants. This college is, I'm assuming, tax exempt and receive tax exemptions of some sort from the local community. I believe they're public roads that run through here. How come those federal and ultimately public investments do not justify this college being exposed to First Amendment liability?
Yeah, that's not something specifically I've studied, but my understanding is that those incidental government functions, the fact that you're hooked into the sewer system, the electric grid, well, it's not government, but, you know, those are not enough to, you know, just like your house is hooked into the public sewer system. There's a road to get to your house. It doesn't mean your house is now a public space. And so I think that's probably the logic there. Now, there are ways that the federal government or any government, the government can condition money it gives you on certain things that might silence your speech. The most famous case is what they call the Solomon Amendment, where the federal government said, you cannot bar military recruiters on campuses or we're going to pull all federal funding from your university. And Harvard, particularly Harvard Law School, did not want to allow military recruiters because of the don't ask, don't tell policy, that if you were gay, you could not come out in the military. And they felt that way. And they didn't want the military, and Congress passed a law called the Solomon Amendment, which says, okay, now you put your money where your mouth is. You don't have to let the military recruiters in, but guess what? If you don't, you're not getting our money. At Harvard Law School, I guess they were able to quantify their principles because they gave up the principle of defending LGBT people by boycotting the military recruiters because they needed the money. Because, you know, you can imagine the federal government to a big university like Harvard, it's probably hundreds of millions a year, maybe billions, who knows. And so now they allow military recruiters. So if you take federal money, now you might be subject to some things, not necessarily the First Amendment, but you might give up some of the rights you might otherwise have.
Good evening, Professor. Earlier tonight you talked about hecklers and how it's an exception to the First Amendment to be disruptive.
Well, I wouldn't go so far to say be disruptive, to be so disruptive that you deprive someone of the ability to speak.
My question is, what is the legal level of disruption that is required?
And I'm glad I'm giving this at the end of the talk, not at the beginning. I think it's, you know, case-by-case basis. I think certainly taking over the stage and forcing the speaker off is an easy one. That's not permitted. Shouting in such a sustained manner that the speaker can't speak or the audience can't hear the person is not permitted. Clapping and boo, I mean, that is permitted. So I think it's just there's a big gray area, and we're seeing it play out on college campuses weekly, where there's some level of disruption. I think a walkout is permitted, where people get up and they walk out. So there's a lot of things you can do. I think the test is always, are you depriving the speaker of the ability to speak or the audience of the ability to listen? And that's a fact-based test on the situation.
I believe someone from out here wants to ask a question. No? All right, next.
Thank you for coming. Are you familiar with the author Nassim Taleb?
I'm sorry?
The author Nassim Taleb, are you familiar? He wrote The Black Swan.
Oh, no, I'm not.
Okay, well, I guess I take the concerns of my friends who say that sometimes speech is very impactful and harmful to them very serious. And I noticed tonight that you kind of focus on the legal aspects of why it's important. But I'm wondering if that's necessarily like the best argument to make for the protection of speech, because Taleb talks about something called hormesis, which is the idea, like when I talk about it with my friends here, when you get inoculation or vaccination, you actually receive a little bit of like a virus that makes your body immune to it. And so I guess it kind of contributes to the idea of you can learn from uncomfortability in ways that you may not be aware of if you don't expose yourself to certain things that you might not necessarily want to do. And I guess when it comes to free speech, I kind of correlate that from biological function in a similar way. Maybe you can only formulate a better defensive argument if you first expose yourself to something that you weren't necessarily thinking would help you think in a creative new way. And I worry that that's my main argument with free speech, that if you don't push yourself into uncomfortable territory, you may actually kind of atrophy an ability to creatively diffuse arguments.
Yeah, I mean, if you grow up in an environment like many college campuses where you only hear one viewpoint and you're never challenged, and then you go out into the world and you are challenged, I think you're less well equipped to deal with it. I don't know if that's what you're talking about. That's what I took away from what you were saying, is that being challenged, even by speech you don't agree with, makes you better formulate your own arguments. If that was your point, then I agree with that. And that's why I think universities and colleges do a disservice to students when they do not promote intellectual diversity on faculty, when they don't promote it on campus. Because it's no service to the left-of-center students to have only left-of-center ideas discussed on campus. Because you know what? Then they wake up one morning and it's 3 a.m. on November 9th and they can't figure out why Donald Trump won because they've only been exposed to people who agree with them and they never had the chance to formulate the counter-arguments. So I think, and this might be a little bit of overstatement, but I've been quoted in the Cornell Sun saying this, so I'll say it again, that I think conservative students on most campuses have to hone their skills better than most liberal students or left-wing progressive students because they're challenged every single day. There's almost nothing they can do on a campus that doesn't get pushback and doesn't get challenged, and therefore every single day they're forced to think about what their arguments are and what their comebacks are. And I think they get better prepared, and this is generally, that doesn't mean every individual, they get better prepared to go out into that real world, because every single day in college they get challenged, as opposed to progressive students who have all these support networks, all these students who agree with them, all these faculty members who agree with them, and really aren't prepared, in many cases, to go out there and confront other viewpoints. So if I've taken away correctly what you were saying, I think that's a disservice to progressive students to not have more debates on campus, to not bring more speakers like me to campus. That should be encouraged, not discouraged, even if it makes some people uncomfortable.
Next.
Hi, I was a little bit curious about obscenity and how that plays into the laws that are made. So first, I just want to get some things clear so I'm not saying anything incorrect. They use the Miller test to figure out whether something is obscene or not.
Yeah, I'm not sure the obscenity standard. It has to be, its test is that it has to be far beyond community standards. Yeah, but I'm not sure what the test is.
I was just wondering, so you said that feelings don't play into, the law doesn't care about your feelings, but in terms of the obscenity laws, I think that that directly plays into feelings because obscenity, I feel like, especially with the test, because I read through the Miller test, it's kind of up to an opinion, and I was wondering.
Well, it's the famous quote from Concurring Opinion was, you know it when you see it, as to what the test is. That there really is no test. But it is not the subjective feelings, I don't believe, of the person viewing it. It's a community-based standard, and it's so offensive that it violates some level of community norm. But I don't claim to be the expert on the obscenity test. But the cases are very clear when it comes to other types of speech that the impact it has on someone's feeling, and I've read you quotes about it, is not part of the test. But I can't speak directly to that part of it.
Okay.
First, unsatisfied customer.
Yeah, given that the topic of this is on hate speech, all of your examples were from the civil rights movement or other liberal-leaning things, which I think no one here today would consider hate speech. So given our present-day consideration of hate speech, can you actually give us some examples that you're saying you should be comfortable allowing to because it's constitutionally allowed, some examples of the hate speech?
Well, I gave the Westboro Baptist Church example. That was ruled to be constitutionally protected speech. I've given the example of the Tiki Torch March in Charlottesville, which a federal judge ordered to enjoin the city from preventing. So there are many examples. There's the most famous one, which when I was growing up, was the Skokie, Illinois, the neo-Nazi march in Skokie. Skokie was a heavily Jewish community in Illinois, which had a large population of Holocaust survivors, and neo-Nazis wanted to march in Skokie. And it's a little bit complicated procedurally, but ultimately the Supreme Court ruled that they could. The Supreme Court didn't actually rule on the substance, it was a procedural thing, but they were allowed to march. And this is a really good example of how I say meeting offensive speech with more speech, not less speech, is the remedy. 8 of them showed up, and there were 1,000 counter-protesters. That happened at Vassar in preparation for my coming here. And my knowledge on this is only a little deep because I saw a news article. I think it was the Westboro Baptist Church came. I'm assuming they weren't allowed on campus. I don't know because they were right at the gate. There was a counter-protest. I think there were 6 of them and 500 at a counter-protest. There was a teach-in, I believe, or some sort of educational effort. There was even a fund created to put to some useful purpose to counter their message. That is the prime example of countering hate, offensive speech with more speech, not shutting them down. And the college did not allow them on the campus. And I'm not going to say that's the wrong decision, okay? They can protest right there. I think you're going to have tough cases like that, okay? You're going to have tough cases in a place like Vassar. And I'm not going to say you can never, prevent somebody from coming. I'm just saying really try to use it for the most extreme cases on a private university. Try to do it using a standard that's consistent, and be aware. People could make, a lot of the arguments that are made against neo-Nazis can be made against communists. The history of communism, communism killed more people than Nazism did. That's just a fact, a historical fact. And if you're going to suppress one, be prepared for the day when someone in power, and they're not in power on this campus, so communist speech is not going to be banned on this campus, but there might be another campus where people do want to ban that. And that's the tension that you have when you ban even extreme speech, that other people may view different speech as extreme.
How do you remedy that with the fact that most of the people committing this hate speech in question come from one particular demographic versus everybody else?
Well, I don't know what that is,
White male. Honestly, white in general.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, there's a woman being disciplined in Canada. I forget the school. I think it's in Toronto. I believe she's an Arab Canadian for denigrating white people. And that was viewed to violate speech codes against racial hate speech. So be very careful, because what you just said at that campus in Canada could be viewed to violate the campus code. And so be very careful on these things. It's never a simple issue. If you're going to empower the ability to silence somebody because they denigrate a racial group or a gender, if someone had come here and said, who's committing all the crime? You say, that's racist. What are you saying? If somebody said there's disproportionate crime in the black community, they probably would not be received very well on this campus, whether it's true or not. So just be very cognizant that a lot of these claims can be flipped, and they are being flipped in places that have strict anti-hate speech codes like in Canada.
Anyone from here? Oh, you. All right.
Sorry. Nice to see I've been sequestered back there for a bit. I suppose my question to you is this. In the discourse on free speech, the sort of dichotomy that's presented is the American conservative movement is for free speech, whereas the left is perhaps against it. I was wondering if you believe that certain factions or elements of the conservative movement are also hostile to free speech.
Yeah, I don't think I ever made that. I don't think I made that dichotomy. In fact, I pointed out that it was the people in power who were against the civil rights movement who were trying to suppress speech. I don't know if I call them conservative, whatever you call them, but they certainly weren't left-wing. So yes, I do agree that there are people on both sides who want to shut down views they don't agree with. It just so happens that at most liberal arts colleges, the dominant view is left-wing, and therefore that's where the problem presents itself. But I would absolutely agree with you that it's a problem on both sides.
So you mentioned that graffiti on wall preaching hate speech is a crime of vandalism and not of harm. When a person writes, kill all the people of a certain identity on a public wall on a campus, is that not a threat? That can incite someone to follow through with physical harm on people, that causes undue stress because it's hard to get through to people. And on a college campus where people live, we live here, and you learn here, this is more than just speech. When you're outside the gates, people are not subjected to have someone come to where they live and do things in a place where they live, so that's the difference between a college campus. And I ask that, when is it more than just hate speech? When is it, in the age of, with the historical memory of like Columbine and Virginia Tech and Sandy Hook, when do we say that hate speech is okay when it can literally turn into something else and a whole group of people can be targeted and killed?
If it's okay if I add to that real quick, I just want to mention events. I want to mention events of last year to put in context.
I don't think it needs context because he made it.
This is her question. This is her question. Yours.
You're not in a scenario, and then
Okay, so a message threatening to kill people. I think that's obviously it's offensive. I'm not defending the message. Whether it's protected speech on this campus, no, it's not, because it's a private campus. If this were a public campus, could somebody be punished? The fact that it has the threat of violence in it, I think, explicit threat of violence, not that someone may react, kill people, I think may take it to a level that it might not be protected speech. I have to do more research on that, but that is a threat of violence as opposed to speech you merely find offensive. There is speech you find offensive which could incite somebody, but it wouldn't necessarily have the direct connection as a call for violence. Now, would it meet the test? Because, like I said, there are many cases that say inciting speech that might incite violence in some unspecified way, unspecified date, might not be protected. So the fact that it has a death threat in it, I think, might make a difference. But if it didn't have that in there, and the First Amendment applied here, it clearly can be prosecuted as vandalism, defacing public property. There is a question about so-called hate crimes. Crime is motivated by prejudice, etc. And there's a big debate about whether that's punishing thoughts or why should the nature of the victim, as opposed to the nature of the conduct, be the guide. So I don't know about yours. I think I have heard something about a library incident, but I know there are many campuses where there are those sort of things, graffiti. So I think that's a tough case because of the death threat contained in it.
Anyone around here?
Hi, you might have sort of answered this a little bit to a certain extent, but I was just, while you were talking, I was thinking about Snowden, because that's like a pretty famous free speech case or issue. And so I was just wondering what you think the difference between a national security versus free speech issue is versus like a personal security versus free speech issue, like something like Charlottesville.
Well, my understanding is that Edward Snowden's crime was not speaking. His crime was stealing a gazillion classified documents that the Russians, which violated. So I don't know that you have a First Amendment right to steal government property, to steal classified documents.
But was that the issue though? I feel like the issue is that he released it to the public.
Well, I don't know if that disclosing classified information is also a crime. I don't see that as a free speech issue. That's not expression. That's a violation of national security laws, which you have no right to that classified information. You have no right to take it. You have no right to disseminate it. You have no right to disclose it. You have no right to talk about that. You can express your views on national security, but you have no right verbally to disclose that information. I don't think that's considered protected speech.
All right. Maybe you should do.
I don't mind asking next.
Now, just one follow-up on that. The press, this is the Pentagon Papers case, the press may have the right to publish it, and the press, having obtained that information as part of freedom of the press, may be able to report on it. But
WikiLeaks, not the press then?
No, because if the press protection there cannot have been involved in the theft of the property. If you're the Washington Post and someone mysteriously delivers to you in the middle of the night a stack of papers that you had no role whatsoever in purloining, as a member of the press, you may have the right to report on it. But if you participated in obtaining that, then even your press freedom does not apply.
All right, so.
Hi, I wanted to ask a question about a comment that you made near the beginning of your speech regarding the fact that because the USA has the First Amendment in their Constitution and have the rights associated with that amendment, that Americans would much rather live in this country because of than other countries, because of the fact that other countries do not have this amendment. Maybe comes my question real quick.
But let me just clarify what I think I said, that if the choice is between living where you have the First Amendment or you don't, I would choose where we do. There may be other factors that would cause you to want to live in that other country. So I wasn't saying that. So with that clarification, go ahead.
Okay. So looking at other countries, specifically the one that I'm from, which is South Africa, we have certain laws such as, like certain laws and acts, such as the Equality Act and Equality Courts that make sure that people do not act or speak on prejudice and like discriminate against others based on race, religion, etc. And how we are currently in South Africa looking towards creating hate crime acts to prevent, to make hate crime illegal. In countries that do not have the First Amendment, like my country, we have different laws. How does this show that America is better, and how does, like, in that context, as well as, doesn't it show that America should look towards reforming and changing their policies, like in the First Amendment, to, instead of accepting them and encouraging them and enforcing them, in order to allow for people to maintain a right of dignity, even though others still have the right to free speech?
Well, I think that's a value judgment people have to make. And a particular individual may prefer to live in a country where you have speech highly regulated. You don't need to go to South Africa, you can go to Canada. They have a lot more of these hate crime laws and things like that. And they have a lot of cases of people being persecuted and prosecuted for ideas which are questionable, quote unquote, hate. You have people less free to speak out. You have tribunals which can bring people up on hate crimes charges. And I think it's a value judgment. If that's the society you want to live in, then I think.
I'm asking for your opinion specifically on whether or not we should include hate speech in one of those.
I don't think we should. I do not believe we should make criminal speech which is hateful if that is all it is. There are many other things, direct threats, other things. But I don't think as a society, offensive ideas should be criminalized, because that empowers the dominant political group to enforce its way through the criminal laws. And if you want to live in that society, I think I said there are many countries where you can live in that sort of society. My value judgment, which you can accept or not accept, because you're asking my opinion, my value judgment is we should not do that, because you know where that's being used now? In Turkey. And Erdogan is rounding up academics, and he's rounding up reporters, and he's rounding up dissidents, and you know what laws he's using to do that? The anti-hate speech laws. Go look it up. Okay? So when you empower somebody to criminalize speech they don't like, then you are risking a dictatorial sort of situation. It doesn't mean every country that does that will go dictatorial, but when you empower the people in power to silence their political enemies through the criminal laws under the guise that the views you're expressing are hateful, then I think you are running a risk, and that's not the country I personally would want to live in.
All right.
By the way, clapping when I speak is permitted.
Anyone out here? Yes? No? Okay, next.
Hi. How are blanket statements not considered libelous or slanderous?
When you say blanket statement?
Like all Muslims are terrorists.
Because the defamation laws, you have to defame a specific person. There's no group defamation recognized in the U.S. as a legal cause of action. So you have to state false facts about a specific person that portrays them in a, by the legal standard, negative light. So it's a very, the right for the defamation belongs to the individual who's targeted. It does not belong to a group. There really aren't many, and I don't want to say there are none, because then somebody will say you forgot this, but there aren't a lot of group rights in the US, even class actions, discrimination cases. It's a group, but it's the harm done to individuals who are allowed to group for legal purposes. I don't know of any law where a group gets to make a claim, be it defamation or anything else.
Sorry, can I just say something to that? What about corporations in that sense? Because has there been litigation recently, such as like ag-gag laws, speech that damages the reputation of a company?
But that would have to be a specific company. I think if you were to say the agro-business industry is horrible and corrupt, but you didn't name a company. On the other hand, if you say this company is corrupt, or this company's product is tainted with mercury when it's not, and you damage, there is that commercial component, but I don't think just, I'm against fossil fuels. I don't think Exxon can sue you for that.
Next.
Hi, my name is Ezra. I'm from Clinton, New York. So.
Oh, yes, Hamilton.
And so I'd like to ask, first of all, do you remember in 2004 or 5 Lloyd Churchill was supposed to speak at Hamilton College?
I only remember it kind of vaguely because my life has multiple dividing lines. One of them is when I started the website, and that was before. So I didn't cover politics very much prior to that, and that was in 2008 when I started the website. So I remember the word Churchill. I remember something about it. I remember it was a big controversy, but I don't remember the details.
Okay, so he said basically about bankers, including Jewish bankers. Little Eichmanns, and he could not speak at Hamilton because it was a bomb threat. Although he said he would have been willing to speak in a bulletproof vest, which I guess I should ask.
Well, clearly a bomb threat is not protected. And if someone made the bomb threat and it can be found out, they should be prosecuted. This is where I get to the freedom of speech is not freedom from criticism. I would have let Lord Churchill speak and I would have criticized him. I think that would have been the proper remedy for that situation. And this is a good example. Hamilton, at least at that time, succumbed to that sort of public pressure and didn't let him speak. And so, that's why I was very gratified that President Bradley stood by my right to speak here and did not succumb to what I'm sure was fairly intense pressure on her office to bar me from speaking. And I hope the people here who maybe were against me speaking felt this was a worthwhile endeavor. And she made the right decision too. And those decisions for a president are never easy. And I don't know who the president was in Hamilton at that time. It's like distant memories for me. But I think he should have been allowed to speak. And if people were offended, they could have done what was done on this campus. A counter event. Whether I think it's wise or not is my opinion. But I don't think there was anything wrong with the students here organizing a counter event or speech. If that's how they felt, they wanted to react to my being here. That's fine by me, and I think at Hamilton that's what should have been done.
I do have a follow-up to say, I guess it's sort of a question that will lead into a separate issue. Lord Churchill's statement that these people are little Eichmanns is very subjective. It's his opinion to be challenged. If you go to Germany and you say that the Holocaust didn't happen, you can be arrested and fined because the Holocaust definitely did happen. So what do you think about laws that restrict speech that disseminates false information, objectively false?
Yeah, I mean, the equivalent here would be like, saying there was never slavery. And obviously there was. Should that be criminal?
Oh yeah, should it be criminal?
Right, I don't, as abhorrent as it is, I don't think it should be criminal. It's tough, the free speech issues are very, very tough. I don't think it should be criminal. I think the way society should react to it is through education, through more speech. I understand why the Germans do it. I understand it. But I wouldn't want to see that here. Thank you. Next.
Hi again. So my question really has less to do with legalities and more with your personal feelings about this topic. I just wanted to address the past few years, we've been seeing a vast increase in public speech that dehumanizes people of marginalized identities. And I think it's pretty hard to argue that that sort of speech isn't psychologically damaging to those people. So within the context of an educational environment, because that's what a college is, do you see any merit at all in a space that doesn't tolerate language that is damaging in that way?
Well, I know that the wording you've used is things I hear a lot. I don't see it that way because I think the risk is too great. That I think people need to learn how to deal with things that offend them. And I think that that's the price that gets paid for having a society where free and open debate is permitted. Because there are a lot of people who feel hurt and damaged by a lot of things the progressive community says and does. And I wouldn't want to see the progressive community criminalized or punished for it because somebody else feels that way. I think when you get into the subjective feelings of people governing who gets to speak and what they get to say, I think that's just very dangerous territory. And that's why my value choice is for more speech, not less. And there may be other ways for people to learn to address whatever harm they're feeling from the words. But I don't think the answer ultimately is to silence the speech. Next.
No. I'm sorry. Okay. That's the procedure, yes. Yes. No. No. You're allowed to ask other people. Wow, I'm not going to do that. Are you going to ask a question or not?
The moon looks beautiful. Everyone.
I'm going to ask you your question, please.
I'm getting there. Thank you, Peter. Hi. Oh my. Oh, thank you. Hi there. I was just wondering about you using a lot of your evidence, right, was trials and court dates and like the law itself, right? And so I'm just wondering about the morality of the Constitution itself and the laws by which you use to standardize and the laws by which you use to decide which speech can be protected or not, right? And I'm just wondering that in this conversation of free speech, where we can challenge these things, and by challenging these ideas, right, using the law, right, which is an idea, essentially, that we've all agreed upon, that's subjective, but you're using the law as a standard, right, by which to say, okay, well, this is correct and this is right, and this is lawful, this is not, this is moral, and this is not. And I'm wondering if we don't use the Constitution, if we use the Constitution as a set of ideas that not everyone might agree with, or was included in, I'm just wondering how different the conversation would be, right? If we think of the Constitution as a document that has been amended, right? Because you're bringing up the amendments to the Constitution, but however, it's central tenets, right? When you're using the First Amendment, Second Amendment, Third Amendment, all that good stuff, was still made, right, so long ago, right? And it didn't necessarily include things that happen today and people that do have voices today, right? So I'm just wondering if by you using the laws, right, as like your examples in the court and the justice system, right? For example, the person who ran those people over during Charlottesville, you said, he'll most likely be prosecuted and charged with etc. law, and it suggested that you trust the court system to do its job. And I'm wondering how much trust you put in this court system, how much trust you put in our laws to protect the free speech that you say is cool and stuff like that.
As someone who's been around courts for a long time, there are no question there are problems, there are injustices that take place. They don't perfectly execute the laws, they don't perfectly enforce rights. It's a battle where people with money often have the advantage. But when it comes to actually the First Amendment, I think the courts actually do a pretty good job. And that people who don't have the resources to fight those fights, there are many public interest groups that will fight them for them. And that is the history of First Amendment litigation, is there's very frequently, like the American Civil Liberties Union, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, there's many others which will fight these court battles. So I actually think with all the problems that the court system has in criminal justice and other things, I think they do a pretty good job on the First Amendment. I think most judges, and if they don't do it, the appellate court gets it on the First Amendment, and I think that people can vindicate their rights. So I totally acknowledge the court system has problems in the civil side, has problems in the criminal side, but I think they actually do a pretty good job when it comes to protecting speech rights.
So you do not think the court system is fundamentally flawed against its most marginalized people?
Well, fundamentally flawed, I'm not sure. I think there's a whole, obviously issue about criminal laws and whether those discriminate particularly against minority communities. I think there are problems in the criminal justice system as well as the civil system. But if the question is, what's the alternative? I think is always the question, and I think that there are problems in the court system, but at least on the topic that we're here for tonight, which is the First Amendment, I actually think they do a pretty good job. It's kind of basic stuff. There are interesting, nuanced cases, but for the most part, the First Amendment cases are not that difficult. And I think most judges and appellate courts get it right. So I think that's the best answer I can give you, is that at least on the topic of tonight, I think the courts do a pretty good job.
Can I ask you where you got your tie from?
My tie? You're the second person. This is my suit tie. It's like the only tie I have. Of course, when I teach, I wear jeans, a t-shirt. So I don't know where I got it. It's probably 20 years old. It says on the back, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, so somebody must have been visiting the Met and bought it at the gift shop.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It is about It is about 8:45. Security has agreed to let this run a little over past 9, but at this time I'm going to issue a last call for anyone who wants to ask a question. So if you want to ask a question, come up now. And that includes over here as well. If anyone wants to, we have enough room, right? Yeah. Great. Yeah, so if anyone on this side wants to ask a question, they can come online as well, but at this time I have issued the last call for people who want to ask a question. All right, and actually this will be the close of people entering the line to ask questions. So it'll be these next 4, and then we'll conclude.
My question is based on the previous person's, and it's why use the Constitution as a basis for why hate speech should not be persecuted when the Constitution has historically excluded groups which are currently being targeted by hate speech. And like to further off of that, like the Constitution wasn't created in a vacuum. It was created at a time when Black people were enslaved and when other marginalized communities, like Indigenous people, were being like murdered and stuff. So I'm just kind of saying that like it's not like free from criticism because the people who created it came in with certain biases and certain beliefs that are still present today. So I don't think that can be used as a basis because it is deeply flawed in a certain fact that like with the like 13th, 14th, 15th amendments, those were used to like finally include Black people within like certain rights like voting rights and just simply being like people. So I don't understand how you can use the Constitution when like it was created at a time where not everybody was seen as like human.
Well, a few things about that is, and this is, I think, going to a debate that's taking place on a lot of campuses. You can read the principles of the First Amendment, and even if you despise the people who wrote them, even if you think it was an unfair process, if people were excluded from the process, are the concepts valid? And I think that they are. I think protecting freedom of speech is whether it was written by slave owners or not, the idea is still valid. And it's incorporated into our founding document, the document by which we've lived. And I think it's a worthy ideal. And to the extent there's something in the Constitution, like it was at inception, that is not acceptable, you can amend it. And it's been amended many times, more than the ones that I've read. So you either have a society guided by a set of principles in writing that the nation has agreed upon and has amended to the extent it didn't agree upon it, or you have a society where there is no guiding principle and it's a free-for-all. And I think the Constitution provides us with that guiding document, and that particularly with the amendments, the principles in here are pretty good. The separation of powers, so we don't get a dictator. The independent judiciary. The amendments I've read to you, the protection of people from cruel and unusual punishment. And the fact that these things were written in the 1700s, the late 1700s, doesn't make them any less valid now, even if you don't like the people who wrote them. And I think that particularly the Bill of Rights is very sound, very excellent guiding principles. And I wouldn't want to get rid of them just because they were drafted in a time when there were a lot of injustices. I think it's pretty good, this Bill of Rights that we have.
However, I would say that the context influences how the concepts are actually being like enacted and like how we actually like manifest themselves. And you cannot read the context from the concepts because the concepts are not created in a vacuum. They're created by people who have certain biases and beliefs, and that influences how they came up with these concepts in the first place and who they apply to.
Well, could you give me an example in any of the amendments I've read today where there's displayed that conceptual, you didn't use the word bias, but conceptual problem in there? I mean, you know, admittedly, the Third Amendment, my favorite amendment, has some kind of strange, outdated, old sort of language. But you know, the amendments that I've read, I think are pretty good. You know, Congress in their state, so it's called government, shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. So we don't have a state religion. You know, or abridging the freedom of speech. So, I mean, if you have an example of where the context in which these were written makes them somehow inoperative, I'd like to hear it. And this gets to a big issue of constitutional interpretation. You take the text, you take what the original intent was, you try to make it more of a living document, read these words in a modern context, and these different views ebb and wane on the Supreme Court, but clearly, you know, the conservatives tend to say we take the text, we take the original intent, the original meaning of the text, because if we deviate from that, then we're just making things up as we go. Whereas I think the more liberals want to say, well, this is a document, times have changed, we need to maybe interpret it differently, but I'm not aware in the Constitution of a provision that would have that conceptual problem, but if you are aware of it, you know, I'm willing to listen.
Okay, so what you're saying is that, like, the context, like, historical or otherwise, it has absolutely no bearing on how the concepts, like, were created. Like, you, like, personally, in your own opinion, do not believe that, like whatever context, like, historical or otherwise, especially when you yourself are kind of saying that you believe, like, in the original intent and, like, what the founders, like, themselves, like, meant to say. How can you, like, talk about the original intent, about, like, what the original meant to say, without, like, viewing it in the historical context in which they lived?
Well, when we talk about original, first of all, I don't think I said I support the original intent. I said conservatives generally take one of three approaches: the plain meaning of the text, the text as understood at the time, and then the original intent of people. I tend to want to just read the words. And if the words are ambiguous, then you try to understand what the words meant at the time it was drafted, which is like what you would do with a contract if you were buying a house. When people speak of original intent, they're typically speaking about the meaning of the words. What did they intend this word to mean, not what they intend the concept to mean. I mean, you can't abridge the freedom of speech. I mean, you don't need to know original intent for that, but if there's a question as to, you know, what the words mean, then you could look to original intent. But I don't think conceptually you're trying to divine what was in their heads. You may be trying to do that when there's an ambiguity.
Next. Professor Jacobson, in your remarks, I don't know if it was intentional or not, but you painted a picture of the college campus as being on the left-hand side of the political spectrum and the rest of the world being more diverse in their thinking. I hope to see tonight that there actually is divergent political perspectives here on campus. That's number one. Number two, you also pointed out in your remarks that every Republican club at Cornell, which is one of my alma maters, comes to you for advice.
Just most of them.
Yeah, and I was wondering as an educator, what kind of advice and issues have come forward during the Trump presidency for you as an educator?
So far, none. No students, you know, I tend to be on an as-needed basis for the student groups. It's their group, it's not my group. I don't try to run the group. If there's an issue, it's usually surrounding money. Or something like that. Nobody has come to me to talk about the Trump administration. It was talked about a lot last spring. Actually, it was talked about a lot after the election. I don't hear a lot of talk on campus about it, kind of surprisingly. Not even in the student newspaper. Kind of odd. I just don't hear a lot about it. You are beginning to hear a lot about it on the DACA issues and the Dreamer issues, but even that, not as much as I would have expected.
Next.
Yes, this actually fits in with what the professor was talking about earlier in terms of reading about divergent viewpoints. I make the point to do that. I'm trying to expose myself to all sorts of different points of view, even those I strongly disagree with. Things far left, things far right, and that I know that's perfectly permissible here in the United States because of the First Amendment, but that brings a question because I do intend to eventually travel. I do intend to travel to Canada or to Europe, where they tend to have strong restrictions. And so since I merely access certain works, not agree with them or say anything in favor of them, would that cause me any particular problems? This is a legal question that's been troubling me for some time. I expose myself to views I disagree with, so is that exposure to my penalty if I go from America to another country?
I'm not as familiar with the laws of other countries. There are countries where if you bring certain books in, you're going to get in trouble. Okay? When I traveled to the Soviet Union, we could not bring books in that had Hebrew writing. And I'm sure there are other countries where you can't bring religious texts to. And I don't mean that as an exclusive list. So, yeah, depending where you're traveling, having certain printed materials potentially could create an issue, if that was the point of the question.
That wasn't the point of my question. I don't mean bringing in material, but I mean reading material in the United States and then going to that other country without said material.
Yeah, I don't see how they could punish you for what you learned over here. But I'm not an expert on however many country laws there are, but I would think that would be a stretch.
Thank you. And a final question of the night.
Hi. So earlier there was a question about what you think the root of this hate speech problem is and why this has been an issue recently. You said that it was likely due, or in your opinion, due to people becoming more sensitive. And I have to wonder, is it not possible that marginalized groups who are targeted by these jokes or by this speech have in recent times gained more of a platform to express their feelings of dehumanization or offense at this speech? And sort of to follow with that, is there not a difference between speech that is offensive to people and speech that dehumanizes them? And should those differences be treated differently legally?
Well, I don't think as a fact they are treated differently legally. And so to get into the should, then I think that how do you distinguish between speech you find offensive and speech you find dehumanizing? How do you draw that line in a consistent way that we can enforce it fairly as to everybody as opposed to what a particular person tends to view? Because the same speech that you might view as dehumanizing, someone else might view as just offensive, and someone else might say, hey, it's just a joke, what are you worried about? So how do you find an objective measure that can be applied to society when you're dealing with people's subjective feelings?
Yeah, well, for instance, we have the Black Lives Matter movement, and a lot of people suggesting that, that all lives matter, perchance, and that Black Lives Matter statement is not valid. And sort of, we have this discussion with the police where we're saying, no, we don't need to value these lives, and I think that there's a lot of hate speech surrounding that, hate speech surrounding the value of specific people's lives over other lives. And I think that there's a lot of speech surrounding that not specifically, but a lot of related to Charlottesville, and specifically the attack on the one man who was a Black Lives Matter demonstrator, and the people there that were attacking him and supporting that attack. I think that's very clearly hate speech, and that's very clearly dehumanizing, because they're saying, you're advocating for your people's lives? No, that's not okay, we can't have that.
Well, the crime was when they hit the person, and the crime was when they beat the person.
The words that incited that crime.
If somebody said, hit that person, or let's go get him, then that's a crime. That's not protected speech. If somebody merely said things that are offensive in a crowd of other people who share those offensive feelings, and they attack somebody, I don't think that person is criminally liable. And that's why I think a lot of these cases can be dealt with through content-neutral laws. If you punch somebody in the face, it doesn't matter why you did it. You had no right to punch them in the face. Now, there are some people who say as a society we should punish it more if it was motivated by racial animus, because we want to discourage that. But to the person who got punched in the face, two people getting punched in the face, one's white, one's black, they both got punched in the face, should they be treated differently, or should their attackers be treated differently? I don't think it's that simple a question. I don't think philosophically it's that simple a question. But when it comes to feelings, then I think we're going too far, because two people could just feel very differently about the same statement, and I don't think we can punish the speaker for that one happens to view it as dehumanizing. That doesn't mean we don't aspire to better speech. That doesn't mean we approve of that speech. But whether it's protected from criminal prosecution is the question.
So one more follow-up on that. You say that it shouldn't be treated differently depending on the motives of whoever does the attack, whoever instigates the attack. When you get in a car accident, if you dent someone's car, generally you're not going to be taken to criminal court for that. However, if you intentionally slam into somebody else's car as an act of revenge, that's criminal. So
right, because
intent
is an element of the crime. You don't have to have a particular hateful intent for that, but intent is an element of the crime in the car. So it's the difference between accidentally hitting somebody and deliberately running them down. If you do it with intent, but why subjectively you intentionally ran them down, I don't know if that should make a difference. And I'm on the fence on that. I'm on the fence on increasing the penalties for bad motivations. Because I do understand the counter-argument that the only objective factor is what you physically did and what harm you caused, and that two people in identical situations, one who had a bad thought in their, a racist thought in their head, one who didn't, the impact was the same. But I understand both sides of that issue, why we might want to deter that sort of racial conflict. So I'm on the fence when it comes to hate laws, it's not that the hate is punished, it's that there's an increase in the penalty or the charging if it's motivated by racial bias. I'm on the fence about that.
Okay, last little thing on that subject. You say that the impact was the same. But I think that when somebody bumps into your car, you say, oh, that sucks. You damaged my car, but it's no big deal. Whereas somebody comes at you and they run into your car, that's so much more threatening and so much more targeted and puts a lot more psychological damage and resentment and anger than if somebody bumps you.
Yeah, I'm not sure it makes a difference in terms of the legal recovery. If you're able to, you're recovering for the for the harm that was done to you, but it's not because the person had bad intent, it's because there was a physical damage to you.
But it is because the person had that intent.
Well, they had intent to harm you. If they didn't, it's not, am I going to deliberately ram into her because she's white, because she's wearing a blue shirt, because she's driving a certain color? But I intended to run into you. That's all that you need to show the intent of the crime. You don't need to show why I had the intent. But I see where you're going with that, and I think that's a good line of argument, that, when it comes, that the harm caused to somebody by a crime which is obviously motivated by racial hate could have a bigger impact on the person. But whereas one not motivated by that, not obviously motivated by that, could have a different impact. But we're still not punishing the hate, we're punishing the physical crime. And that's why I say it's a tough question. I'm really on the fence about that one.
All right, that will do it for our Q&A session.
Open to get one more question if you have time.
I think Vega.
So the type of speech that we're seeing in Charlottesville in the libraries and the type of views that organizations like the Westboro Baptist Church or the neo-Nazi groups that we've been seeing recently, these types of views that they are expressing They're going beyond offensive, it seems. We're speaking about people who go beyond controversial ideas or beliefs. Speech that is actually emotionally damaging. For instance, the Westboro Baptist Church has started families of dead military personnel in the past. At points where they're extremely vulnerable to emotional damage. Dead soldiers and families coming home, and they're out there protesting these events. So, like students before me have said, just because something is a law, free speech protecting these the abhorrent acts of these Nazi organizations or the Westboro Baptist Church, that doesn't mean it's moral. While laws may not be biased or...
I do have to ask for time sake to get to your question.
It's getting up.
I need you there now.
Oh, no!
Sorry, it's fine. Security's got me on a tight time. I believe you to get your question.
So while laws may not be biased, many people are. And they use laws in such a way to marginalize others. By saying that the way to stop this is to punish them through other laws, doesn't seem like it's solving the problem. For instance, if you're punishing them over graffiti as opposed to the intent behind why they put the graffiti up there. The laws aren't working, and so I guess my question is, have you not seen any laws or amendments to laws that could improve upon or change for the better what we've been discussing here today?
Well, is it kind of, have I seen any or recommend any changes? I'm a little unsure of the question, so I'll try to answer it as I think you asked it. The First Amendment, which is what we're talking about here, can have results that people don't like in specific cases, like the Westboro Baptist Church or whatever this library incident that happened is. I don't know if that's protected speech or not because I don't really know what it is, but several people have made reference to it. Swastika graffiti, all that sort of stuff. The question is, should we change the First Amendment to punish things we don't like? And I just think for all the reasons I've said in my 45-minute speech and the question and answer, I think that's the damage to society, to a university from clamping down too heavily on speech, outweighs that harm from seeing the symbol or seeing the words graffitied. And I think we're better off dealing with it in the way that was dealt with the Westboro Baptist Church, where they had a teach-in and a fundraiser, and they turned a bad event into a good event. And I think if you take those opportunities as a society in the long run, we'll be better off, as opposed to silencing people, because one day you may be the one who gets silenced by the people in power, and I don't think that would be something you want to happen. So that's why I say, particularly on private university campuses, these are tough issues, but my initial bias is to err on the side of more speech rather than silencing people.
Thank you.
I just have a few remarks before we all leave. I just want to say this is the biggest event we've had in the VCLU history. So I'm very glad that you all came.